Inshallah, I'll go ahead and get started. I apologize for the delay. This is what happens when you do online programs. Last minute, there are issues. So we usually don't have a problem here with connectivity. But interestingly enough, this whole month of Ramadan, this is the only program that right before I was trying to get online, it kept giving me a message that the internet isn't connected. There was a thunderstorm, and I was driving back home, and I was hearing the thunderstorm, but I didn't think we would have any issues. But so, anyways, hopefully this the internet on my phone will keep up, and inshallah we'll be able to go through the program together, inshallah. So the topic that I was going to be presenting on and discussing for a little bit is the topic of Quran and Hadith, and the relationship between Hadith and Quranic exegesis or Quranic interpretation or Quranic tafsir, whatever terminology we want to use for that. Essentially, what is the role that Hadith plays in us understanding the verses of the Quran better? This is a very important discussion. It's a little bit of a technical discussion as well, but one that has many different implications in the way that we understand the verses of the Quran. Sometimes the different understandings that we have of how Hadith is supposed to explain the verses of the Quran to us can fundamentally change what we understand from the verses of the Quran. And we'll go through some very real life examples of this as well, where there are verses of the Quran that are pointing towards a particular duty, but because Hadith is there, Hadith then tells us, for example, that this duty is limited to a specific time, a specific area, for example. And that plays a big role in our lives today as well. So allow me to begin from here. This is a very important discussion of the role that Hadith has as it relates to the verses of the Quran. So the first question, or the first point rather, that we have to explain and we have to go through is, why are we taking the words of a human being to explain the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Of course, this human being is ma'soom. Of course, this human being is a human being that does not speak on his own behalf. So that part of it is pretty clear to us. And the verses of the Quran also shed some light on this as well. The famous verse of the Quran, this is verse 33 from Surah An-Nahl. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الذِّكْرَ لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِّلَ إِلَيْهِمْ. We sent down this Quran to you, Ya Rasulullah, لِتُبَيِّنَ, so that you would explain to people what this Quran consists of and what the meaning of this Quran really is. So this is just an important point I want to explain, because many times you will find people, when they want to pinpoint where something is in Islam, or whether something even is found within religious teachings or not, they'll pose this question. They will say, where can I find it in the verses of the Quran? And the reality is that that is an incomplete way of looking at the teachings of Islam. Not everything that is part of the teachings of Islam will be found in the verses of the Quran. And that's an important point to remember. And anyone who has doubts about this, or anyone who at times has questions about this, the one thing that I really bring up to them is, I ask them if they prayed that day. If they say, yes, we prayed, and that's normally the response that I would get, then I would say, well, how did you pray? Because, Quran doesn't tell us how we're supposed to pray. And this might seem like a very simple issue for us, but I can tell you, traveling to different communities and speaking to different individuals within these communities, our youth as well, this is one question that they have many times, and it's many times an area of confusion for them. So the Quran itself is telling us that you have to go to the Prophet. Even if the Quran had not said this, we would still understand this, because if someone is bringing us a book, and that person who's bringing us the book also adds some information with regards to the book, you would take it. You wouldn't reject what that person has to say. So it's clear that Hadith has a place in our understanding of the verses of the Quran. But in order to now get a little bit deeper into the discussion, there comes the first principle when it comes to the role of Hadith in the verses of the Quran. And that is a principle that is been mentioned in multiple hadith of ours. So those same hadiths that say that, hadith has a role in us understanding the verses of the Quran, another portion of that literature speaks about the importance of taking these hadiths and presenting them to the verses of the Quran. These are a number of ahadith. Shia and Sunni have narrated these ahadith, known as the riwayat or the ahadith of al-'ard, presentation, right? When you present something to something else. And this terminology is used to explain that you're supposed to take hadith and present it to the verses of the Quran. And if it's something that goes against the verses of the Quran, this is something that the Ahlul Bayt repeatedly have made it clear that you are not to act upon that hadith, you are not to accept that hadith. Okay. So like I said, Shia and Sunni have narrated these ahadith. Of course, within other schools of thought, there's a slightly different understanding maybe of what these ahadith are trying to get at. Within the Shia school of thought, though, the unanimous understanding really is that these ahadith are trying to tell us that if we come across a hadith that does not match with the verses of the Quran, it does not mesh with the verses of the Quran, it goes against the verses of the Quran, this is a hadith that does not hold value. And this is another important principle to remember. Within the Shia school of thought, we do not have any book of hadith that is considered authentic from cover to cover. There is no such a thing. In other schools of thought, you might have a little bit of that concept. Though even in those schools of thought, there is a little bit of differentiation between this hadith and that hadith and whatnot. But within the Shia school of thought, we definitely don't have such a thing. So every hadith has to go through a filtration process, so to speak. And the first filter, and probably the most important filter, is whether it is compatible with the verses of the Quran based on these ahadith. So some of them you will find in Al-Kafi, many of the other ones you will find in other sources of ours. This hadith I'm going to share from Imam Sadiq salawatullahi wasalamu alayhi is found in Al-Kafi. He says, خَطَبَ النَّبِيُّ بِمِنَى, that the Prophet was reciting a khutbah in the land of Mina. فَقَالَ أَيُّهَا النَّاسِ مَا جَاءَكُمْ عَلَى مَا جَاءَكُمْ عَنِّي يُوَافِقُ كِتَابَ اللَّهِ فَأَنَا قُلْتُهُ. Whatever comes to you that is compatible with the Quran, I have said it. Meaning that if it has the other conditions, you can take it as my word. وَمَا جَاءَكُمْ يُخَالِفُ كِتَابَ اللَّهِ فَلَمْ أَقُلْهُ. And if it was something that goes against the verses of the Quran, know that I did not say it. It's very beautiful. The Prophet, in this hadith in particular at least, he doesn't say, get rid of it. Some hadith say that as well, right? But in this hadith, he says, I never said it. Meaning that, listen, it's not even possible for me to sit here and say something that goes against the verses of the Quran. If anyone brings something like that to you, know that it was never my words. They just made that up. It's something that is, just being narrated on my behalf. Okay. And like I said, there are multiple hadith in this regard. Now, the question though is this: what does it mean for a hadith to go against the verses of the Quran? What does it mean for a hadith to be uncompatible or incompatible rather with the verses of the Quran? If the verses of the Quran say, for example, that this prayer is wajib, and hadith comes up and says, you know what, this prayer is wajib only during these times, is this considered incompatibility? This is where the discussion gets a little bit more technical. There's one opinion, of course, I say one opinion, there's multiple opinions here, but this is just for simplification for our discussion. There's one mainstream opinion, and that is this: that as long as there is not a complete incompatibility between the hadith and between what the verses of the Quran are saying, you can take this hadith and you can work with it, so to speak, to then reach a conclusion as it relates to the interpretation of that verse of the Quran. In other words, if a verse of the Quran simply says, this duty is wajib upon the Muslims, and then the hadith says, yes, it's wajib, but in these situations, this is a situation where the hadith is not in full incompatibility with the verse of the Quran, and therefore you can take it, right? And a lot of the fiqh that we have today is based on this, right? At least within the Shia school of thought, a lot of it comes from this. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on. So this is the general understanding. As long as it's not fully incompatible. Yes, if a hadith shows up and says, for example, that this Prophet of Allah was committing these sins, and the Quran on the other hand says, no, innahu kana mukhlasan wa kana rasulan nabiyya, for example, about some of the prophets, then this goes against the verses of the Quran. You can't go based off of that hadith. As we do, we have hadith that prophets used to have committed sins, and these are hadiths that have been narrated, right? As many hadith have been narrated. So That's an example of full incompatibility. Or for example, a situation where the Quran says this is wajib, the hadith says no, this is not wajib. This is full incompatibility. This is the mainstream opinion in this regard. This is how most, I would say most scholars have understood these ahadith. There is other opinions that are starting to be formed, and those other opinions go a little bit further than just saying, is this hadith in direct incompatibility with another verse of the Quran? Some have gone further and they have said, if you come across a hadith and this hadith goes against the overall atmosphere that the verses of the Quran are creating with regards to a specific topic, that is also considered a form of incompatibility. Okay? So what does that mean? If the verses of the Quran in general teach us that we are to be kind, for example, to our loved ones, we are to be kind to the servants of Allah, and then hadith comes and says, no, you should do this or you should do that, that goes against this general atmosphere, this is where we set aside this hadith and we go with the general structure and the general atmosphere that the Quran is portraying for us with regards to this topic. This is a more technical topic, and scholars, contemporary scholars, of course, are giving their opinion on this topic, and they're continuing to discuss it. And it can fundamentally change a lot of the different ways that we look at the ahadith. And this can play a very, very big role. Nonetheless, let's move on from this and delve into the 5 different ways that hadith explains the verses of the Quran to us. The 5 different ways that hadith will help us understand the verses of the Quran. The first of them is when a hadith explains a specific term to us. There's a term in the verse. We do not know what this term exactly refers to. Hadith will give us an understanding of that term. So for example, what we read in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse number 3, the longest, one of the longer verses of Surah Al-Ma'idah. حُرِّمَتْ عَلَيْكُمُ الْمَيْتَةُ وَالدَّمُ وَلَحْمُ الْخِنْزِيرِ. Then the verse continues and it says, وَمَا أُهِلَّ لِغَيْرِ اللَّهِ بِهِ. And that which is sacrificed for other than Allah. Hadith of Imam al-Jawad explains to us that this that was sacrificed for other than Allah, for example, was that which they used to sacrifice for the idols. And the verses continue, وَمَا ضُبِحَ عَلَى النُّصُبِ وَأَن تَسْتَقْسِمُوا بِالْأَزْلَامِ, and that they used to have these raffles, and they used to use arrows to draw a raffle. Yes, it was more of like a form of lottery, if you want to think about it. Hadith explains to us what this terminology of the Quran is referring to. This is one simple way that Hadith explains the verses of the Quran to us. There's less discussion here, so I want to move on a little bit faster from this. So that's number 1. Number 2 is where Hadith is not explaining a specific term for us. Hadith is adding a condition or making an exception to the verse. Yes? This is where we call, the Hadith does taqyid, for example, of the verse. Very important discussion. And this is it's a little bit of a technical discussion, but it's also very beneficial for our communities as well to know. And that is many, many situations you will come across verses of the Quran making a general statement. But because this is a general statement, there is room for hadith to now come and to either make an exception to the verse or for hadith to come and limit the scope of the verse. Yes? And I think the best example of this, one that we deal with, and a question that I've received before many times, is with regards to Salatul Jum'ah. Salatul Jum'ah is, of course, a salat that apparently the Quran says is wajib. And apparently it says it is obligatory at all times. Yes? Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu idha nudiya lis-salati min yawmil jumu'ati fas'au. You're supposed to, not only are you supposed to go, you're supposed to rush, right? Fas'au, it comes from sa'i. So you're supposed to rush ila dhikrillah. So other schools of thought, of course, have understood the verse to mean that it's obligatory, right? Or at least some. So then within the Shia school of thought, then you ask, well, why is it that it's not wajib for us? Why is it that it's not obligatory for us? Yes, I've had this question asked of me multiple times by our younger brothers and sisters. And the answer is, well, hadith says, yes, it's wajib, but it's wajib, right, when the imam is there. وَالْإِجْتِمَاعُ إِلَيْهَا فَرِيضَةٌ, as the hadith says, مَعَ الْإِمَامِ. That's multiple hadith talk about this, that it's wajib for one to attend the Jum'ah when the Imam is there. So hadith is taking a verse of the Quran that is making a general statement, and it is limiting its scope in this particular case to a particular scenario. And that if that scenario is not there, therefore the ruling is no longer there. This has happened so many times in Quran and Hadith, in the relationship between Quran and Hadith. And many times when people come to the verses of the Quran and they're expecting one ruling from the Quran, and in return, the fatwa of the Maraji is something else, a lot of times it comes back to this, right? So this is the second way that Hadith and Quran interact with one another. Very, very important point. Number three, sometimes Hadith will explain for you something with regard to the verse of the Quran that the Quran is not even necessarily alluding to, that the Quran is not even necessarily touching on. This is the third way that Hadith helps us in the understanding of Quran. So to give you an example of this one, a good example of this is the relationship between Hadith as it relates to that verse of the Quran that has to do with the performing of wudu and the way that one performs wudu, right? So the Quran, of course, the verse of the Quran says that when one is going to come and do wudu, that he is supposed to wash his hands up to ila al-marafiq. Yes. Hadith now comes to us and tells us how we are to do the washing ila al-marafiq. But when Hadith says this, Hadith is explaining this simply because the verse of the Quran was not even pointing to this idea. The verse of the Quran was just saying you are to wash from the tip of your fingers all the way to your elbows, ila al-marafiq, right? Otherwise, the Quran doesn't tell us how we are to do this. So this is a third relationship where Hadith says, and this Hadith is from, this one in particular is from Zurara, from the sixth Imam, if I'm not mistaken, forgive me, from the fifth Imam, Abu Ja'far, in which he asked the fifth Imam about the wudu of the Prophet, right? And it's interesting in the Hadith, the fifth Imam, it says that he smiled when he heard the question that Zurara asked, and then he explained to him. He said, "This is how the Prophet used to do wudu, that he only used to go downwards; he wouldn't go upwards, and that over time, people they started to change this wudu of the Prophet." Yes, and then he explains this. So this is the third type of relationship that we find between Quran and Hadith. I'm going to move on from this to get to the fourth and fifth point, because that's where really as we say, the crux of the discussion lies, and the part of the discussion that I'm personally interested in discussing a little bit more. The fourth relationship between Hadith and Quran is where Hadith is not explaining a particular term. It's not adding a condition or an exception to the verse. It is not adding details that you do not find in the verse. It's not that. It is explaining a particular application of the verse, a particular example of the verse, what we would refer to as a misdaq of the verse of the Quran. And many times, because people have misunderstandings about these ahadith, they assume that the hadith is trying to explain the verse, whereas the hadith is trying to explain an example, an application, a misdaq of the verse. Therefore, what the hadith is saying is not going to be incompatible with the general understanding of the verse itself. No, the verse has its own meaning. The hadith is saying that one of the masadiq of this verse of the Quran is this issue, for example. And the reason why this is so important is because the number of ahadith that we have that are revealed as it relates to the verses of the Quran having to do with the Ahlul Bayt are probably more than you can count. I mean, there's so many ahadith out there that speak about, for example, the person behind this verse of the Quran, or what the verse of the Quran is referring to is Fulan Imam, for example, is Ahlul Bayt, for example, is Ali ibn Abi Talib, for example, is the 12th Imam, for example. Yes, a very good example of this is the ahadith that we have as it relates to the return of the 12th Imam. So many ahadith that speak about how verses of the Quran in reality are referring to the return of the 12th Imam. Wal Fajr, wal Layalin Ashr. Hadith says Al Fajr, daybreak, this new hope, this new horizon. It refers to the return of the 12th Imam, and many other ahadith as well. The important thing to understand here is that the hadith is not trying to tell us that, listen, this verse no longer means we swear by the daybreak. No, the verse is trying to say if the Quran swears by the daybreak and it's speaking about the daybreak, that there is another example, another mistaq of this daybreak, that is the return of the 12th Imam, because the return of the 12th Imam is like a daybreak, yes? It's like that first moment of the morning where light starts to, starts to shine bright, and hope returns back to the world. And then other verses of the Quran you find of this type as well. وَنُرِيدُ أَن نَّمُنَّ عَلَى الَّذِينَ اسْتُضْعِفُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَنَجْعَلَهُمْ أَئِمَّةً وَنَجْعَلَهُمُ الْوَارِثِينَ. Famous verse from Surah Al-Qasas. Hadith says this is the return of the 12th Imam. This hadith is saying this is an example of the return of the 12th Imam. Not that you now replace the words of the Quran and you say, وَنُرِيدُ أَن نَّمُنَّ عَلَى الَّذِينَ, for example, Ahlul Bayt. This is all about the Ahlul Bayt now. No, the verse is a general verse. It says we constantly do this. Yes, it is, فِعْلِ الْمُضَارِعِ. Yes, we're constantly doing this. But yes, one of the biggest examples of it and applications of it is the return of our beloved 12th Imam. Then you find other examples as well. For example, صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Hadith says, and this is hadith from the 6th Imam, he says, غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. He says, yes, المغضوب عليهم النصاب, right? Those who, they have nasb when it comes to Ahlul Bayt. Those who have hate towards the Ahlul Bayt, right? And then he says, ولا الضالين are those الشكاك الذين or الشكاك الذين لا يعرفون الإمام, those who do not know the Imam of their time. The verse is not saying that, the hadith is not saying this is the meaning of the verse. It's trying to say these are examples of that verse. Yes. And probably the best one that I want to point out here, because if you're a Shia, I'm sure you've heard of this hadith before, that when we recite اهدنا الصراط المستقيم, yes, hadith says الصراط المستقيم هو علي ibn Abi Talib, that as-sirat al-mustaqim, the straight path, is Ali ibn Abi Talib. And so many of us within the Shia school of thought take this to mean that, yes, the Quran was referring to Ali ibn Abi Talib, whereas the Quran was referring to the straight path. An example of the straight path is Ali ibn Abi Talib. Therefore, as-sirat al-mustaqim, referring to Ali ibn Abi Talib, and as-sirat al-mustaqim, meaning the straight path, they are completely compatible with one another. They do not contradict one another. Yes, this is the fourth relationship that Quran and Hadith have with one another. I'll move on to the fifth, and then inshallah, I'll be wrapping up very soon. The fifth is a situation where the Quran is talking about one concept. The Hadith will take that concept and give you a deeper interpretation of it. The Quran will give you the basic understanding. Hadith will give you what we refer to as the batin of the Quran, the different layers of the Quran. We know that the verses of the Quran have different layers. Yes, there are these butun, as the hadith says, 7 butun, and every button has a button of its own, and it just continues and continues. So there are deeper layers of this meaning of the verses of the Quran. But the important point to remember is that the deeper layer and the apparent meaning of the verse of the Quran, they do not contradict one another. And within the Shia school of thought, many times this is the way we understand it. We understand them to be contradicting one another, in the sense that when we hear of the batin of the verse, we assume that's the meaning of the verse. And that is the only meaning that the verse can have. Whereas that's not what the Ahlul Bayt are teaching us. The Ahlul Bayt at times are teaching us this is at a deeper layer, this is what the Quran is referring to. But at an apparent level, at a basic level, it still has the basic level that you understand from the words of the Quran in the Arabic language. So some examples of this. Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. Okay, we have a basic understanding of this verse. As the verse continues, then it gets into that analogy, yes, that there is this light, and this light is sitting in the niche of the wall, for example, and it continues until it gets to nurun ala nur. That light is so powerful that it's light upon light, right? Now, what exactly is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala trying to say here? It's a separate discussion, and it's a deeper discussion. But the point is, hadith tells us Allah nurun ala nur means one imam after another imam. So what, this verse doesn't talk about light anymore? No, it's talking about light at a deeper layer, right? At a deeper level. The hadith is telling you and I that there is a batin to these verses of the Quran. And the way to differentiate between this relationship that Quran and hadith have with one another. And number 4 that we were discussing, the relationship of the mistaq and the verse, and the application of the verse is that when the Quran is speaking or when hadith is speaking of the batin, usually making the connection between these two, the connection between what the hadith is saying and the connection between the verse of the Quran is very difficult. In the sense that you and I, if we would look at the verse of the Quran, we maybe would never be able to make this connection between these two. And another example of this is what we recite in Surah Amma or Surah An-Naba, right? The beginning of Surah of Juz number 30. Amma yatasa'alun 'anil naba'il 'azim. Of course, we have hadith that an-naba'il 'azim refers to none but Ali ibn Abi Talib. But you see, if we were to sit here and just look at the verses of the Quran, if it was just us and the verses of the Quran, we would never be able to guess that an-naba'il 'azim is referring to Ali ibn Abi Talib. Yes? Therefore, this shows that the Ahlul Bayt are showing us some of the deeper layers and levels of the verse of the Quran, number 1. And number 2, that does not go against the verse still referring to the day of judgment as well. عن النبأ العظيم مفسرين, if not all of them, majority of them have said النبأ العظيم refers to the day of judgment. Making this connection between النبأ العظيم and Ali ibn Abi Talib as it relates to this verse from Surah An-Naba is much more difficult than making the connection between Ihdina as-Sirat al-Mustaqim and Ali ibn Abi Talib. Yes, because as-Sirat al-Mustaqim, he's the right path. Of course, following him is the right path. Therefore, it's a lot easier to make that connection. Yes, so that's when the hadith is explaining the mistaq of a verse. Sometimes, no, making that connection is something that only an imam can make. Only someone who has that special knowledge of Allah can make. Then he is the one who sort of unveils the meanings of these verses of the Quran, yes? And tells us that, listen, this verse that you're reciting, though you have a basic understanding of the meaning, at a deeper layer, at a deeper level, there's a different understanding of the verse of the Quran. And there are, of course, many other verses of the Quran in which Ahlul Bayt have sort of pointed to this idea. Yes, وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا وَوَضَعَ الْمِيزَانَ أَنْ لَا تَطْغَوْا فِي الْمِيزَانِ. Yes, hadith says al-mizan is Ali ibn Abi Talib. If you were to give us these verses and Ali ibn Abi Talib, we would never be able to make the connection on our own. Yes, so this is where Ahlul Bayt are giving us a deeper understanding of the verses of the Quran. That understanding, of course, is an understanding that they have and that they grant only to, of course, the special servants of Allah. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as I'll be wrapping up inshallah, we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He makes us amongst those who can reach a level, who are blessed with this deeper understanding of the verses of the Quran. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that all of our brothers and sisters who are in difficulty, who are in pain, who are going through difficult times with this virus that we have, with other illnesses and diseases, we pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala frees them from their difficulties, inshallah. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that all of those who are dealing with oppression, injustice, what we heard happening in Afghanistan just a couple of days ago, what we hear happening in Palestine these days, just so sad and so concerning and worrying. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He frees all of these brothers and sisters from their difficulties and pains, inshallah. And finally, last but not least, we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He hastens the return of our beloved 12th Imam bin Nabi wa alih. Rahimallahu man qara'a al-Fatihata ma'a as-salawat.